Hi there, welcome to The Real Agenda with me, Tom Burgess. Thanks for joining us and I hope you're keeping safe and well. Now today we're discussing democracy with Tom Brake, the former Member of Parliament who is now Executive Director of Unlock Democracy, the pressure group which campaigns for a more participatory democracy in Britain, founded upon a written constitution. Where did our democracy go? Can we have it back, please? Or has it always been there? The Real Agenda is a podcast series that focuses on finding the answers to the fundamental issues of our time, notably the extreme economic inequality and the unnecessary financial hardship suffered by millions every day. Episodes cover economic justice, corporate responsibility, inclusive prosperity, as well as democracy and protecting our planet, because that's the real agenda. So on to today's show. Is a good democracy important to the improvement of well-being of the nation? It was the American Supreme Court judge, Louis Brandeis, who famously said, "We can have democracy or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." So what do you think? Should we just let the wealthy few decide everything? I don't think so. And following on from a comment on an earlier episode of our series, The State We're In, with Gavin Esler on the Real Agenda Network, Gavin commented that the UK thinks it's the mother of all parliaments, but no other country in the world has an unelected second chamber. And how did we get a government majority of 80 out of 650 seats, with only 44% of the popular vote? And how come most prime ministers are educated at Eton or one of the other fee-paying schools for the privileged, and then go to Oxford and Cambridge? Are we a democracy, or are we just an old boys' club? Then if we combine these facts with the reality that our governments consistently fail to deliver what the nation wants, toxic inequality continues to ruin lives, and financial hardship is a reality of life for the majority of the population. So I was keen to find some answers as to how we can make change happen. Who better than Tom Brake, who spent 22 years as a Member of Parliament, and since then took up the role as the new head of Unlock Democracy. I started by asking Tom, what is wrong with British democracy?
Well, there's more than one problem with British democracy. The first one that I would identify is that for a quarter of people in the UK, it is not working, according to a YouGov poll, a recent poll. And in the same poll, a total of 70% of people said that they had either no say or little say in how the UK is run. So I think that's the first problem, that people don't feel that democracy, or a lot of people don't feel democracy is working for them. The second problem, I would say, is that we have a false sense of security about our democracy. People often refer to the UK as being the mother of all parliaments, but the mother of all parliaments a year or so ago was very nearly shut down by our Prime Minister. And more recently than that, we have a government that decided that it was appropriate to break international law. And I think in most democracies, or certainly in the UK democracy, until, for instance, the government decided they were going to break international law, most people would have thought in our democracy the rule of law was something that would always automatically be upheld by our government. And unfortunately, that has proven not to be the case. And finally, I suppose the final problem with our democracy is how democratic is our democracy? I'm pursuing a government minister at the moment, or the Cabinet Office, for putting out a tweet that said that following the Parliamentary Constituencies 2020 Act, that now everyone's votes counted the same. Well, because the government's argument is that they have standardized more or less the size of each constituency. But if you look at how many votes it takes to elect a Conservative Member of Parliament, the answer is roughly 30,000 votes. How many votes it takes to elect a Labour MP is roughly 50,000. How many votes it takes to elect a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament is over 300,000. And how many votes it takes to elect a Green MP is over 800,000. So I would say that our democracy, certainly in terms of reflecting the views of voters in Westminster with the number of MPs that represent their views, is hopelessly undemocratic. So those are three substantial problems, I would say, with our democracy.
So how did we get there in this situation, that the democracy is so flawed or is indeed not working?
Well, first of all, we are very heavily reliant on a first-past-the-post voting system that now in Europe isn't used by any other country. And this is something that clearly we're in a sort of turkeys don't vote for Christmas type scenario. In other words, any new incoming government that secures a majority, a very comfortable majority, as the Conservatives did, an 80-seat majority on the basis of 43% of the vote, is not exactly inclined to change the voting system to ensure that it represents more accurately the views of voters. And the same could be argued over the Labour government in 1997, which had indicated that it was open to the ideas of reform. But when Labour were elected, I think on a just under 40%, I think, of the vote it was then, with a 200-seat majority, suddenly the enthusiasm for electoral reform dissipated. So we have a political system that makes it very hard to ensure that voters' views are represented accurately, and the fact that this voting system rewards parties with often very substantial majorities on the basis of a minority of the vote, I think leads to an arrogance in terms of their perception about the legitimacy of those governments. In contrast, for instance, to the New Zealand government, which has, even though it has a majority, has taken on board, I think, members of the Green Party to try and give a more representative government. In the UK, when a government wins a substantial majority on the basis of a minority of the vote, it believes that it is entitled to do anything, so an elected sort of dictatorship in effect, and they are entitled to interpret the rules flexibly in the way that Boris Johnson tried to do in relation to his plans to shut down Parliament. I think that it's partly the voting system, a voting system which then I think encourages political parties to believe that they have a right to do things which I think on the whole the electorate don't approve of.
Well, that's right. I mean, polls are showing that people are not getting what they actually want. So things like inequality resolved or improved and so on, but nothing is being done about it. We're getting completely different things from really what people want to see. Is that right?
Yes, and I think that is that it's going to be interesting how the government responds to the election of a number of Conservative MPs in the so-called red wall seats who want a levelling up agenda. Now that is going to come sort of clash head on with the government's or the Conservative Party's sort of priority areas, or at least the areas where they have the most MPs elected, in the southeast, for instance, who may feel that a levelling up agenda will happen at the expense of levelling down in London and the southeast. So it'll be interesting to see how the government resolve that dilemma and are able to satisfy both the demands from people in the southeast for better transport because we suffer significant congestion problems, historically have suffered overcrowding on the trains and tube. Clearly that doesn't apply at the moment. And the demands in the northeast, for instance, for decent transport connections for them. It's very hard to see how the government are going to reconcile these two conflicting sort of demands, particularly at a time where the public purse is going to be under a huge amount of pressure once hopefully COVID is dealt with as a medical crisis, the government are then facing a long-term financial crisis in terms of trying to address a public debt, which will be very, very substantial indeed.
So I think we agree that our democracy is flawed and it's not working effectively. But interestingly enough, wasn't it the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Report that actually gave the UK an okay democracy? Interestingly enough, the US was given as a flawed democracy. So it was quite surprising that, because I thought the UK, as you've explained, we've got a lot of issues to resolve.
Well, clearly the UK, we are, in contrast to many countries around the world, we have a democracy that is still strong. There are almost whole continents that one can write off from a democratic point of view in having few or any democratic governments. But that's not to say that British democracy is perfect, and that's not to say that British democracy cannot be improved. And some examples of that, for instance, as well as our antiquated voting system that no one else in Europe uses, we have a House of Lords, which again is a model of a second chamber that legislates, that is replicated, I think, now nowhere else in the world. I think in the past, Papua New Guinea might have had a similar similar unelected chamber as ours. But the fact is that the House of Lords legislates for the United Kingdom. The House of Lords, as we've seen from the latest round of nominees put forward by the Prime Minister, is packed with people who are political cronies, who are there because they have contributed large sums of money to one or other of the political parties, and it's true of all political parties, not just the Conservatives. And that smacks of, it doesn't smack of cronyism, it is cronyism of the worst sort. And that cronyism, something that incidentally Unlock Democracy members believe should be at the top of our list of things to tackle, that cronyism is something that has also been reflected in the Towns Fund. That was the fund that Mr. Jenrick and Mr. Berry, two ministers, signed off large sort of multi-million pound packages for their respective towns when there was no evidence that actually in terms of a hierarchy of need their towns would have been the top recipients of said funds. And that cronyism is reflected also in the way that we have the bizarre scenario where someone who used to be the manager of the pub where Matt Hancock lived has received a large PPE contract from the government, having had no previous relevant experience as far as one can tell. This doesn't look good for either the handling of public money, and it does smell rather badly of cronyism.
What about the role of money in our democracy? I mean, obviously in some countries it's a lot worse than the UK, and we do have various controls. And I think comparing it to the States, I think the Americans spend 50 times as much per voter as it is in the UK. And there was that quote from an American lawmaker, we can have a democracy, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we can't have both. Do you think that applies to the UK?
I certainly welcome the fact that in the UK we have tight controls over spending that is possible in an individual constituency backing an individual candidate. That is welcome, because that means certainly that in terms of the campaigning that is of a localized nature, it's not too exclusive. In other words, candidates who stand for Parliament in the UK don't have to have a multi-million pound fortune behind them, although clearly for people like Richard Drax, they may have that, so it can be helpful, but you don't need to have a multi-million pound fortune behind you to stand for election, because the amount that can be spent on materials, so leaflets, for instance, that refer specifically to a candidate during a general election campaign are roughly £12,000 or £13,000 for the 4 weeks of the campaign. So that is welcome, and certainly I think it would be a retrograde step if the UK moved to the sort of system that they have in the US, where, for instance, you can spend large sums of money on advertising, TV advertising, where, as I understand it from talking to congressmen and women, they spend a huge amount of their time, probably the majority of their time, fundraising for the next election campaign. And of course, with very often, the successful fundraising comes with strings, and there are expectations from the big donors as to what the person they have supported financially might say or do if they are elected. But the area in the UK where we still have an issue in terms of spending is the amount that parties can spend nationally on campaigning that is of a national nature, where that funding or that the campaigning can be specifically targeted. It can be directly targeted at a very small number of constituencies. So although the materials that might be going out in that constituency only refer to the Conservative Party, for instance, they will overly focus that national spending that they're allowed to spend on national campaigns on a very limited number of marginal seats, thereby potentially swamping the campaigning that is able to be done at a local level by their opponents by using a very large chunk of the national spend on those very marginal seats. And of course, the Conservative Party is the best financed party and will no doubt be able to spend up to the new limit in the next general election, something that the other political parties are very unlikely to be able to do.
Okay, so we've talked about, the problems we have with our British democracy, but what can be done? What would be the sort of top 3 recommendations you would make if you were asked to do that?
Well, first of all, we have to have a voting system that reflects the views of voters, and currently it doesn't. The last opinion poll, for instance, suggested that if a general election were held tomorrow, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens combined would secure, I think, just over 15.5% of the vote, and would get for that 3 seats. If those parties got 15.5% of the seats in Parliament, they would get over 100. That is unacceptable in any democracy, I would argue. So that has to be addressed. The other big issue that Unlock Democracy focuses on is the issue of a written constitution, and a written constitution that would be arrived at following a citizens' assembly or a deliberative process in which citizens would be involved. So that would be addressing the fact that 70% of people think they have no say in the way the UK is run. In a citizens' assembly or deliberative process, they would be very directly involved in producing a written constitution, which could then ensure that measures such as a fair voting system were included in the constitution, measures such as the UK government would observe international law were included in the constitution, so that no future government could, on the basis of a very small majority, because changes to the constitution would be achieved through a two-thirds vote, or two-thirds supporting a particular change to the constitution, no government in the future on a very small majority could ram through proposals that have a major constitutional impact, such as, for instance, the Brexit vote. And I suppose the final thing I would mention is that we need, in a functioning democracy, we need proper transparency and accountability of ministers. On the transparency front, extending, for instance, freedom of information would be welcome, something that I campaigned for when I was a Member of Parliament, extending, for instance, FOI laws to cover the role now that is increasingly played by the private sector when they do public sector work. So at the moment, if the public sector performs a role, for instance, in relation to prisons, FOI requests can come in and they have to be answered. If the private sector is performing exactly the same role, they are not subject to FOIs. I think greater transparency and also greater accountability for ministers. We have now had far too many examples of ministers breaking the ministerial code, Priti Patel being the one of the most prominent breaches of the code, where because there is no independent enforcement of the code, it depends on the Prime Minister enforcing it. Ministers are repeatedly breaching the ministerial code, and the Prime Minister is repeatedly letting them off the hook. Reinforcing the ministerial code, taking responsibility for enforcing and acting on its content away from the Prime Minister, and perhaps handing that responsibility over to an independent body, would be another way or a third way of strengthening our democracy.
What can we, the people, do about it to make that change happen?
Because we do live in a democracy, even under COVID conditions, members of Parliament should be held accountable and made to account for their actions. And although members of Parliament now are working remotely, individual constituents can and should lobby their members of Parliament and should continue to do so. If they don't get a response the first time, try to do so the second time. Flag up to government that a scenario where to get a Conservative Member of Parliament elected requires 30,000 votes, to get a Green Member of Parliament elected requires 800,000, is not a true democracy. And make sure that when government ministers take actions that people think are suspect, that they are held to account through their constituents and through the wider population. Ministers obviously are, individual MPs are responsible to their constituents, but ministers as a whole are responsible to the country or to the electorate as a whole. And of course, you'd expect me to say as my final comment that if people are worried about the state of our democracy, they should join organisations like Unlock Democracy, whose purpose is to campaign on these issues, campaign on transparency and accountability, fair voting system, making sure that powers are devolved down to the lowest level possible, making sure that citizens are properly engaged in discussions about changes that will affect them directly. That is the sort of issue that Unlock Democracy campaigns on, and we welcome new members.
Well, that's good to know. Thank you, Tom. That's very interesting. Finally, what particular campaigns is Unlock Democracy working on?
Well, the big campaign we're running at the moment is around the future of the Electoral Commission. So the Electoral Commission is the independent regulator which looks at how parties spend their money nationally on election campaigns, and the Conservative Party have threatened to abolish the Electoral Commission. I think that is a fitter peak in terms of the Electoral Commission having investigated particularly Leave campaign spending during the Brexit referendum. So we're campaigning to secure the survival of the Electoral Commission. We are also campaigning on the issue that I flagged up about the government claiming that every vote is worth the same, when the evidence points to the fact that a Conservative vote actually, compared to, say, a Green, is worth a good sort of 20 times more than a Green vote. The next big set of elections that the country is facing in May, assuming they take place, and there must now be a question mark over that, but I think we can't continue to postpone our elections indefinitely. The next big set of elections in May cover council elections, but also Scottish and Welsh elections, police commissioner elections, and a number of mayoral elections. This is going to put the focus on what local authorities and mayors are able to do in their local area. So that is going to be a campaigning area for us, because we believe that the evidence from perhaps other countries abroad is that when, for instance, COVID has been tackled perhaps by regional bodies, such as has happened in Germany, that has been a more effective approach than trying to do everything from the centre, as the UK tried to do. And therefore, we're going to make devolution in the run-up to those big, probably they are the biggest set of elections that we will have ever had, apart from a general election. We will make devolution a big focus of our campaign in the run-up to May in 4 months' time.
Well, that sounds really interesting, Tom. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And, we wish you all the best in your campaign and in your relatively new role there at Unlock Democracy, and good luck, and hope to speak to you again soon and see some of these things actually progressing.
Very happy to do that.
Okay, all the best. Speak to you again soon.
Great.
Thanks, Tom, for your time to explain to us and give us some hope. There is much work to be done if we are to break the chain of complacency over our dilapidated democracy. You can find out more at unlockdemocracy.org.uk. What do you think? Contact us at info@realagendaradio.org or via our website, realagenda.org. We'd love to hear your views. And if you're polite enough, you could receive a signed copy of my book, From Here to Prosperity. The Real Agenda Network aims to inform, inspire and involve those who want a democratic, inclusive and fairer society that respects human rights and protects the planet. So what's up next on the Real Agenda Network? Well, we're really excited that we've seen more and more of you listening to the Real Agenda Network over recent months. The last 6 months of 2020, the audience was 4 times higher than the first 6 months. And there's always plenty to choose from on the Real Agenda Network. Apart from this show, The Real Agenda with Tom Burgess, we offer a range of related shows on this channel. Recently added podcasts from Extinction Rebellion, Institute of Public Policy Research, that's the IPPR, New Economics Foundation, The Forgiveness Project, and a new show called The Self-Centered Podcast. In addition to podcasts from organisations like Compass, Compassion in Politics, the Equality Trust, Tax Justice Network, Taxpayers Against Poverty and Unlock Democracy. A special thanks to our sponsors, the Reverse Media Group, one of the fastest growing search and media companies. Find out why at reversemediagroup.com. One thing is certain, people want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for people over party. But it's not happening. But it can. It's urgent, and it's up to us to make it happen. Because that's the real agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.